If you use an iPhone, there's a good chance it was produced at a massive factory complex in Zhengzhou, China, a city with a population of roughly 9.5 million in Hainan, one of the historically impoverished provinces. Approximately 1.2 million people work in factories owned by the Taiwanese electronics company Foxconn, which makes the majority of the world's iPhones. The plant produces 500,000 phones each day, or up to 350 per minute, especially during the hectic summer months before the fall introduction of a new iPhone. Every iPhone that comes out has the text "Designed by Apple in California, assembled in China" printed on the rear, because products made in China must be clearly labeled as such per US law. The plant has given rise to iPhone City, as locals have termed it. It may be the most well-known factory in the world, but it's also one of the most closed off and secretive. Outside Foxconn's gates, manufacturing workers live in dorms in 10 or 12-story buildings, and below them, a migrant workforce of entrepreneurs and sellers set up businesses to make a living by selling trinkets, providing massages, and cooking street cuisine. This area was all dirt, wheat, and cornfields a couple of decades ago. The local farmers' land was purchased by the government in 2010, and the plant opened its doors the following year. Since it started making iPhones for Apple, Foxconn has been under fire for alleged labor violations, unfavorable working conditions, and harsh penalties for mistakes made by employees. In 2010 and 2011, there was a wave of suicides among Foxconn employees, which prompted Apple and Foxconn to make adjustments at the factory because despite the nature of the controversies, the pros of outsourcing production to China outweighed the cons. Since the iPhone is such a small, intricate gadget, correctly assembling one necessitates vast assembly lines with hundreds of workers who construct, examine, test, and package each item. Because China was the only nation in the world with a sizable, ready-made supply chain and the capacity to scale up production fairly quickly, Steve Jobs initially moved the majority of Apple manufacturing there. But now Apple wants to leave. Even though China has been instrumental in making the iPhone the best-selling product in the world, Apple still wants to move its production elsewhere. But why? In this video, we will tell you all about the departure of Apple from China to India and why many American companies might be following suit. Why is China no longer the best place for mass production? Welcome to another project. Apple didn't always make its products in China. The company previously employed thousands of Americans to create its computers in states like Texas, Colorado, and California. The company is famous for having begun by creating computers in a garage in Silicon Valley. In 1980, when Apple announced intentions to build a 150,000 square foot production facility in Carrollton, Texas, and a 43,000 square foot plant in Cork, Ireland, the company was newly public and preparing for the launch of the Apple II. Apple establishes its first manufacturing facility in Asia in Singapore the following year to produce circuit boards. It continued to establish other facilities in the U.S. throughout the 1980s and 1990s, including in Fountain, Colorado, Elk Grove, California, Cupertino, Carrollton, and Cork. But it was still struggling to make profits, which forced it to make major layoffs in 1985 and 99. Due to declining sales and growing losses, Apple sells its Fountain facility to contract maker SCI Systems. In 2004, it closes its remaining manufacturing facility in the United States in Elk Grove, laying off 235 full-time employees. At this point, factories in China are where the majority of Apple's production is being done. Many are run by Foxconn, a division of Han High Precision Industry Co. that also assembles its iPhones and iPads as a subcontractor. Steve Jobs first relocated the majority of Apple manufacturing to China since it was the only country on the planet with a sizable, ready-made supply chain and the ability to scale up production pretty quickly. Three primary factors make China, and more specifically the Shenzhen region, an important industrial hub. Shenzhen is a strategically located city that acts as a bridge between Hong Kong and mainland China. With a huge container port, it is one of the biggest shipping hubs on the planet. Second, Shenzhen was designated as the nation's first special economic zone by the Chinese government. SEZs are intended to promote business through flexible planning rules, attractive tax breaks, and most importantly, by facilitating foreign investment in local businesses. Its ability to grow at such a scale is largely due to this, rather than its geographic advantages. Third, considering that the SEZ was created back in 1980, the city has had more than 40 years to develop into the manufacturing hub of the IT industry. Apple is dependent on a vast network of vendors and subcontractors, some of whom may only produce a single tiny component. The logistics of collecting everyone in one location for assembly are simple because the majority of them are headquartered in Shenzhen and its close vicinity. At the time, producing one iPhone in the US cost around $65 more than doing it in China, where the cost is thought to be $8. The profit Apple made on each iPhone would be reduced by this extra $65, but it would still exist. Apple's typical gross margin was around 40%, and the average selling price of the iPhone was around $600. With that in mind, Apple's gross profit per iPhone was probably in the neighborhood of $250. Today, Chinese factories are far larger and more nimble than American ones. They have the ability to hire and replace tens of thousands of employees almost immediately. They have the ability to call upon the workers at any time because so many of them reside on-site. Additionally, they are able to modify manufacturing methods and rates quite quickly. This is made possible by the fact that China currently has a much larger supply of engineers with the necessary qualifications than the United States. On paper, it seems Apple has benefited the most from its close ties to China. So, why is it moving its manufacturing from China to India? Before we proceed, please consider liking and subscribing below. It goes a long way in supporting the channel. JP Morgan analysts predicted that by the end of 2022, Apple will shift 5% of the world's iPhone 14 production to India, where it will increase capacity to build 25% of all iPhones by 2025. A few years ago, Apple started assembling some of its products in Vietnam and India, thereby reducing its reliance on China. The iPhone 14 is now being assembled in Chennai on a production line for the native Indian market. The action is a part of a strategy to separate the company's manufacturing activities from the Chinese government and is the first time iPhones have been produced outside of China in the same year they were introduced. After China, India is the second largest market for smartphones, and Apple has been producing phones there since 2017. However, up until this point, Brazil's and the country's industrial operations had both concentrated on putting together older models. Vietnam, on the other hand, will produce 65% of AirPods, 5% of MacBooks, and 20% of all iPad and Apple Watches by 2025. Apple is experiencing problems as a result of the deteriorating US-China relations. This summer, in order to comply with a long-standing but previously unenforced Chinese law that requires imported goods to falsely suggest Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China, Apple asked Taiwanese suppliers, including chip manufacturers, to label the origin of their products as Chinese Taipei. The request came after Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the U.S. House, visited Taipei. In contrast, Taiwan requires that products bear either the name Taiwan or the official designation of the nation, Republic of China. The decision to demand that vendors deny Taiwan's independence has drawn outrage from all over the world. Which brings us to another reason Apple wants to cut the umbilical cord with China. Relying on authoritarian nations to act rationally and predictably can go wrong, as the invasion of Ukraine demonstrated. It may be impossible to imagine a scenario in which the U.S. attempted to impose sanctions similar to those imposed on Russia against China, but Apple will undoubtedly be preparing for it nonetheless. Apple is taking a stance against Russia because it can afford to do so. It has halted all exports to Russia, ceased all domestic sales, disabled live information in Apple Maps, limited access to state media apps from abroad donated to humanitarian causes, and essentially tripled staff donations. One terrible scenario might easily lead to another. China might feel empowered by what it observes in Ukraine and decide that the time has come to finally annex Taiwan. Putin has just shown that the danger of a full-scale nuclear exchange makes it impossible for the West to defend Ukraine with military force. All that the armed forces can do is wait in the hopes that the economic sanctions will finally be successful. Taiwan would also fit this description. Although there is what some have referred to as strategic ambiguity, the U.S. is theoretically committed to aiding Taiwan in defending itself against invasion. Another reason behind China's departure is the country no longer has cheap labor. According to Oxford Economics, labor expenses in China now are just 4% less expensive than those in the U.S. when productivity is taken into account. This is so because pay growth in China has outpaced productivity growth by a wide margin. Chinese labor costs have significantly increased as a result of the yuan's strengthening. The United States has seen significant productivity gains that have reduced labor costs. The bottom line: producing goods in China is no longer a certain strategy to obtain cheap labor. So, what does this mean for the future of Apple? Due to its improving operational circumstances, cost competitiveness, cheap labor costs, large talent pool, and success in meeting outsourcing needs, India has risen to become the second most sought-after manufacturing hub in the world, moving it closer to China in terms of popularity. So moving production there is probably a safe bet. Though the effects of an invasion of Taiwan on the world economy would be significant, a large portion of the world would once more apply financial sanctions on China. Could Apple, however, afford to stand on moral ground there? If it stopped production in China, it would not only lose a significant amount of its sales there, but would also be completely unable to meet global demand for its products. And the production is only a small fraction of Apple's exposure to China. According to its most recent numbers, Greater China accounted for more than 17% of its overall revenue in the most recent quarter. Even with a GDP per capita of $10,000, a country with 1 billion people nevertheless has a rich middle class that is comfortably larger than the entire population of the UK. No matter how diverse its manufacturing has gotten, Apple would suffer irreparable harm if it lost that market. Apple likely believed it had years to break its reliance on China. The way things are going now suggests that it could have been too late. To put it another way, this is just the beginning of the story. So let us know what you think would happen if Apple halted production today in China. Leave a comment below. You can click here to learn how Japan's tech industry failed, and here to know more about why Samsung is hated in South Korea. Until next time.